What if your last laugh wasn't one of happiness, but of revenge? I witnessed the day Harriet Thorne, an 88-year-old woman, decided that her last act of love for her family would be to prove they never truly loved her. And what I discovered is that the greatest inheritance someone can leave isn't money, but dignity. Think of the scene: a dinner table, laughter, and secret plans for your inheritance. But for Harriet, the sound of her family was just the echo of greed. Today, I'm going to show you how a simple donation was her way of getting silent revenge, and how being labeled crazy was the gift that set her free. You'll understand the cost of underestimating a woman who spent her entire life fighting for what she believed in. Every second matters, because ignoring the voice of someone who loves you can have devastating consequences. Stay with me until the end to find out what was written in that will, and why the last sentence Harriet left for her grandson was proof that her revenge was, in fact, an act of profound love. You won't believe what happened to the family after they read those few words. I was Harriet Thorne, and at 88, I could feel the weight of years pressing on my bones, but not on my mind. My body had begun to betray me. My knees ached in the morning, and my hands trembled when I poured tea, but my thoughts were still sharp enough to cut glass. I lived alone in the same colonial house I'd moved into as a young bride in 1960, its wooden floors groaning, like an old friend every time I walked. Providence had been my whole world, its winters biting, its summers slow and sticky, its people still whispering behind lace curtains. I had built a life here, filled with books, protest flyers from my suffragette days, and the faint scent of Arthur's cologne still lingering in our bedroom, even after 22 years without him. That Saturday morning began like so many others, sunlight pooling in the dining room through the sheer curtains, the smell of coffee brewing, the faint sound of gulls in the distance. But there was a heaviness in the air I couldn't name, as though the house itself knew what was coming. My children, Mark and Laura, had called for a family meeting. I already knew what that meant. Over the past months, they'd been circling like hawks, asking questions about the house, the value of the antiques, whether I'd thought about the future. They thought I didn't notice their eyes scanning the furniture as if appraising it. When they arrived, they didn't come alone. Laura, in her cream-colored coat and heels that clicked too loudly on my porch, had her husband trailing behind her. Mark, always in a suit, even on weekends, brought his daughter and son-in-law. They filled my dining room with expensive perfume, loud voices, and the clink of china. My house felt smaller with them in it, their conversations overlapping, their laughter a little too rehearsed. I stood in the doorway, my hands resting on the back of a yaki chair, watching them as one might watch strangers. The meal was laid out: roast chicken, green beans, and fresh bread. I had cooked it myself, despite the arthritis that made my fingers stiff. As we sat down, I could feel the shift. No one spoke about the food. Instead, Mark cleared his throat and began, "Mother, we've been talking, and we think it's time to make some arrangements." Laura nodded, her lips pressed together in a way that suggested sympathy, but reeked of calculation. They spoke of helping me, of taking some of the burden off my shoulders. I let them talk, sipping my tea, my eyes moving from one face to the next. It wasn't the first time I'd heard this kind of talk, but today they were bolder. Mark leaned forward, his voice taking on that falsely reassuring tone he used with clients. "Mom, this house is too much for you. We could sell it, get you somewhere comfortable, closer to us." I could see the gleam in his eyes. Real estate had made him rich, but nothing would feed his ego like selling his own mother's historic home. Laura chimed in about downsizing and how modern living would be easier for me. Her words were sugar-coated, but I could taste the greed underneath. Then came the moment that made my chest tighten. One of my grandchildren, my own flesh and blood, leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "Grandma's gone crazy, you guys. She'll never agree to anything." The others laughed. Not all of them loudly, but enough for the sound to fill the room. It was a small, cutting kind of laughter, the kind that makes you feel like you've been shoved into a corner where no one can hear you. My fork paused mid-air, and for a second, I wondered if Arthur, had he been here, would have slammed his fist on the table for me. But I didn't. I didn't raise my voice, didn't defend myself. I just looked at each of them, one by one, until the laughter died down into awkward silence. My eyes rested on my grandson last. I wanted him to see the way my heart was breaking and hardening at the same time. There was a clarity in that moment, sharp as ice. They didn't see me as their mother, grandmother, or the woman who'd fought for women's rights and marched in protests. I was an obstacle, and obstacles are meant to be removed. I excused myself from the table, my voice steady. "Enjoy your meal. I'll be upstairs." I walked to my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. My knees hurt with each step, but there was something new in me now, something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet, deliberate resolve. I sat at my writing desk, pulled out a pen, and began making the calls and arrangements I had been postponing. That was the last time I sat at a table with my children. I didn't go back downstairs that day. From my window, I could hear their voices drifting up, muffled but still tinged with irritation. Someone, Laura, by the sound of it, said something about me being dramatic. I let the words pass over me like cold wind. I'd learned long ago that not every insult deserves a reply. Instead, I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a folder I'd been keeping for months. Inside were documents, letters, and the contact information for Dr. Benjamin Hale, a local historian I'd met at a lecture about Providence's preservation efforts. He had admired the house, called it a rare surviving witness to the city's colonial past. I had smiled politely then, but that night, I called him. My voice was calm as I asked, if I were to give this house to the Historical Society, what would that take? He didn't hesitate. It would take someone who understands the value of history, Mrs. Thorne, and it would take paperwork. The days that followed were quiet, eerily so. I stopped answering Mark's and Laura's calls. At first, they rang every day, their voices on the answering machine shifting from concern to annoyance, to outright anger. Then the calls slowed. The silence gave me space to think, to move through my home with new eyes. I touched the spines of books Arthur and I had collected on our travels. I ran my hands along the banister he'd polished every spring. I sat in the front parlor, where I'd hosted women's meetings in the 60s, and felt the walls hum with the voices of women who had fought beside me. This house wasn't just mine. It was a story, and stories deserved better than to be traded for a quick profit. By the second week, Dr. Hale came by with the notary. They walked through every room, asking questions, jotting down notes. I found myself telling them about the house's quirks, the stubborn window in the library that never stayed open, the faint outline of a burn mark on the kitchen floor from the Christmas of '78. They listened like these details mattered, like they saw the same value I did. That night, I signed the first set of documents, transferring ownership of the property to the Historical Society upon my death. There was a strange lightness in my chest afterward, as though I had locked the door on greed itself. On the morning of the third week, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the last draft of my will. The notary had prepared it exactly as I'd instructed. The estate, including the house and its contents, would go to the Historical Society, but I had insisted on one final section, an addendum, handwritten by me, to be read aloud. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I wanted them to understand what they had done, how they had made me feel. I wanted them to remember the dinner, the laughter, the way they had looked at me as though I were already gone. And so, I wrote each note with care, each word chosen like a stitch in a wound I was closing. To Mark, I left a small, worn photograph, him at 7 years old, holding the red toy car he'd begged for that Christmas. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but it was the memory of a boy who once looked at me with love instead of calculation. To Laura, I left a tarnished silver locket with Arthur's hair. Inside, the one she had admired as a teenager but never asked about. To each grandchild, I left a copy of my favorite book, one they'd never read, with an inscription. For the grandson who had called me crazy, I wrote, "My dear, I hope you never feel invisible." I sealed the will in a manila envelope, my hands steady. That night, I sat in the parlor with a blanket over my knees, looking at the fire. I thought about Arthur, about the children we had raised, about the love that had once filled this house. I wasn't bitter. Bitterness is for those who still hope to change the past. I was resolved. My life had been mine to live, and now my legacy would be mine to choose. I fell asleep in my armchair, the flames fading into embers. the quiet of the house wrapping around me like an old quilt. When they found me 3 days later, I was in my bed, the morning light spilling across the room. The notary came with them, using the key I had given him. Mark's face was pale, Laura's expression unreadable. They moved through the house like guests, not owners, as the notary led them to the dining room. He placed the envelope on the table and began to read. My voice, in ink, filled the room, even though I was no longer there. I imagined their faces as each word landed, how they shifted in their chairs, when the memories I had written became too sharp to ignore. When he read the addendum, the air in the room must have thickened. I pictured the grandson's eyes dropping to the floor when his inscription was read aloud. I pictured Mark holding the photograph, his thumb brushing over the creased paper, realizing it was the only thing I had left him. I pictured Laura's fingers tracing the locket, feeling its weight, but not its worth. And then, I imagined the silence. No one speaking, no one daring to laugh, just the sound of their own thoughts pressing in. Mark didn't speak right away. He sat there staring at the photograph like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve. I knew that picture had been buried in an old album for decades, forgotten in a drawer, yet here it was, his only inheritance. He probably expected deeds, bank accounts, maybe even a portfolio of investments. Instead, he had a paper-thin reminder of a time when love wasn't transactional. I imagined him shifting in his chair, realizing that there was no way to sell what I had given him. No one could put a price on the innocence of a child smiling at his mother. Laura, on the other hand, tried to mask her reaction. She held the locket delicately, like it might fall apart in her hands. For a moment, maybe she even remembered the day she'd first seen it around my neck, years ago, before life turned into a series of dinner parties and charity galas. But the tarnished silver, the faint smell of cedar from my jewelry box, it wouldn't fit in her glass cases or match the polished image she'd built. She could polish it, perhaps, but she couldn't polish the truth behind why it was hers now. The grandchildren fared no better. They flipped through the pages of the books I had chosen for them, probably wondering why I hadn't left them something useful. Each inscription was short, but deliberate. Some were reminders of childhood summers. Others were apologies for moments I hadn't been able to mend. And one, especially the one meant for the boy who had called me crazy, was a mirror held up to their own thoughtlessness. My dear, I hope you never feel invisible. I could almost hear the way those words would echo in his head, soft at first, then louder with each passing year. The notary read every line with an even tone, never glancing up to watch their faces. When he finished, he placed the will back in its envelope and stood, his job done. There was no dramatic outburst, no slamming of fists like at that dinner weeks before, just silence, the kind that seeps into the walls and stays there. They had come expecting division of wealth, and instead, they'd been given division of truth, a truth they would have to carry long after my name stopped being spoken in that house. I imagine Mark tried to recover first, probably suggesting they could contest the will. Laura might have nodded, but even she would have known that my arrangements were airtight. I had worked with people who understood the law better than my own children ever could. Contesting it would be throwing money into a fire, and worse for them, it would be public. Providence is a small place, and reputations here take years to mend. They might have left that house with their heads down, the notary locking the door behind them, the click of the lock final in its sound. Outside, I imagined the air biting against their skin, the street looking the same as it had when they arrived, yet feeling entirely different. Maybe they looked back at the house one last time, thinking of all the memories trapped behind those walls, now belonging to strangers who would treasure them more than they had. It's funny how a building can feel alive when you think it's yours, and suddenly turn cold when you know it never will be. I had always believed that endings should be clean, like a well-written sentence. That day, in my absence, I gave them theirs. No open doors for reconciliation, no lingering promises of maybe one day, just the finality of knowing that I had chosen my legacy over their greed. They would inherit the stories they told themselves about me, nothing more, nothing less. And maybe, if they were lucky, those stories would keep them warm when the regret settled in. Some people might think it was harsh, but I see it differently. Harsh would have been leaving them everything and letting them strip the soul from this house within a week. What I gave them instead was something they couldn't auction off or remodel, a reminder of who I was and who they had been when they thought I wasn't looking. The last laugh, if you could call it that, wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and final, just like me. Word of, my will spread faster than even I would have imagined. Providence had always been a place where the walls had ears, and my decision became the kind of story people murmured about in the produce aisle or while waiting for coffee. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me in years started telling each other about the times they'd been inside my house, about the creak in the third stair, about the smell of Arthur's pipe tobacco in the den. The local historical society issued a statement calling it a gift of incalculable value, and suddenly my name was in the paper, right next to a photo of the house in its winter coat of snow. I wasn't there to read it, but I like to think some of my so-called friends clipped it out and stuck it on their fridge. Mark and Laura hated that publicity. I can imagine the way they squirmed seeing my name praised for something that kept them empty-handed. Mark, especially, had always been obsessed with image. He had built a career convincing people to trust him, with their homes, their investments, their dreams. Now, here I was, his own mother, painting a very different picture of him without saying a single word about his intentions. The irony would not have been lost on him. Laura's circle, on the other hand, thrived on gossip, and this, to them, was a feast. Her friends at the country club whispered behind her back, wondering aloud why her mother would bypass her own children for a public institution. I can imagine her plastered smile as she insisted. It had all been a misunderstanding, or mother's eccentric streak. But every whisper chipped away at the flawless persona she'd cultivated for decades. Social humiliation can be more cutting than any legal defeat. Meanwhile, the Historical Society moved quickly. Volunteers came in to catalog every item in the house. The bookshelves were documented, the china photographed, the old rugs carefully rolled and stored. I had already made notes for them. Yellowed index cards tucked into drawers, describing the history of each piece. Mahogany table, 1864, bought in Boston, used for Sunday dinners. Teapot, chipped on the spout, from Arthur's mother. These weren't just objects. They were the breadcrumbs of a life lived fully, and the society treated them with the reverence my family never could. In the weeks that followed, the house began to transform, not in the way my children would have done with contractors and glossy design magazines, but with preservationists' care. Cracks in the yaw. Plaster were patched, the paint on the shutters refreshed in the original deep green, the garden pruned but left wild enough to keep its character. I like to think Arthur would have approved, leaning against the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching the place he loved being tended to with patience instead of stripped for profit. Mark and Laura didn't return to the house after that reading. I'm sure they told themselves they were too busy, or that there was nothing left there for them. The truth, though, is harder. They couldn't bear to walk through those rooms knowing they'd been locked out forever. They'd been shown, in the most public way, that their claim over my legacy had been nothing but an assumption. And assumptions, as they learned, can crumble in an instant. My neighbors, however, began to see the house differently. Some told reporters about the marches I'd led, the speeches I'd given in the town square back when my voice carried further than my legs could take me. Others recalled how Arthur and I had opened our doors to families during the blizzard of '78, setting up cots in the parlor and serving hot soup in the dining room. These stories, tucked into the corners of other people's memories, began to surface, and I became something more than just the old woman in the colonial house. I became a chapter in the city's history. Even the grandchildren, I suspect, started to feel the sting in quieter moments. Maybe one of them put the book I'd given them on a shelf, only to find themselves drawn to it weeks later. Maybe they opened it, read my inscription again, and wondered if I'd been right all along. Regret is slow. It seeps in like water through a crack in the roof. At first you barely notice it. Then one day, the whole ceiling gives way. The opening ceremony for the house's new chapter came sooner than anyone expected. The Historical Society worked tirelessly, not only restoring the property, but curating it as a living exhibit of Providence's heritage. On a crisp Saturday morning, a ribbon stretched across my front steps, the same ones I had climbed for nearly 6 decades. Local officials stood shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, neighbors, and curious townspeople. A brass quartet played softly, the notes floating into the air like they had been waiting years for this moment. I wasn't there, of course, but I can picture the way the morning light would have hit those white columns, making the house glow like a proud sentinel. In a crowd, Mark and Laura stood at the edge, partially hidden behind a group of older women from the Preservation Society. They hadn't been invited personally. It was an open event, but their presence didn't go unnoticed. The whispers started as soon as they arrived. That's her son. That's her daughter. No one needed to say more. Faces turned toward them with a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment, the kind of look that says, "We've read the papers. We know the story." For two people who had built their lives on control and image, it must have been suffocating. Inside, docents guided visitors from room to room, pointing out original features and telling carefully preserved stories. They spoke about Arthur's study, with his old roll-top desk and worn leather chair, about the library's floor-to-ceiling shelves, and about the parlor where I had hosted meetings for women's rights. My handwriting appeared on little placards beside certain objects, brief notes I'd left for the curators to use. Arthur's favorite reading spot. Don't move the chair. The sunlight falls here just right at 3 p.m. Visitors leaned in to read these, as though they were peeking into a private diary. Mark kept his distance from these rooms, hovering in the hallway while Laura trailed behind a group, pretending to admire the silver tea set in the dining room. But she couldn't ignore the conversations happening around her. People marveled at how much of the house's character had been preserved, how the donation ensured it would be a cornerstone of the city's history. Someone even said aloud, "It's rare, for a family to let something like this go. Most would just cash in." I imagine Laura's jaw tightening at that. The grandchildren came too, each holding their books. At first it seemed like a gesture of compliance, as if they were simply acknowledging my memory in a socially acceptable way. But then I saw in my mind how one of them, perhaps the same who had called me crazy, paused in front of the display case holding my typewriter. A docent explained that I had used it to write letters to senators, to organize rallies, to send articles to the local paper. The boy, now a young man, might have run his fingers over the glass, realizing that I had been more than just a grandmother with old-fashioned ideas. Reporters moved through the crowd, jotting down quotes and snapping photos. One approached Mark and asked how he felt about his mother's decision. I imagined the hesitation. Before he answered, the way his eyes might have flicked toward the cameras. She always did things her way, he would say, trying to keep his voice neutral. But even that lukewarm acknowledgement would be printed in the next day's paper, a quote that revealed far more than he intended. When the ribbon was finally cut, applause filled the air. The sound carried across the street, down the block, into the neighborhood. It wasn't just for the house. It was for what it represented: independence, preservation, a refusal to be diminished. The crowd began to filter inside, but some lingered on the lawn, talking about how they'd bring their children back for tours, how they hoped to attend the lectures that would now be hosted in the library. My home had become part of the city's bloodstream, and no amount of family discontent could undo that. By the time the event ended, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the porch. Mark and Laura slipped away quietly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The grandchildren stayed a bit longer, drifting through the rooms as if trying to absorb something they had missed before. Maybe they understood now, at least in part, that I hadn't acted out of spite. I had acted to protect something bigger than all of us. And perhaps that realization would follow them, quietly, for the rest of their lives. In the weeks after the opening, the house became a steady hum of activity. School groups visited on weekday mornings, their chatter echoing down the hallways as they learned about Providence's past. On weekends, history enthusiasts and out-of-town visitors wandered through the rooms, guided by volunteers who spoke with pride about every detail. My name appeared in local publications more than it had in decades, not as a mere obituary, but as part of articles about women who had shaped the city's cultural and political identity. The fact that my story was being told on my terms was something my children couldn't change, no matter how much they wished they could. Mark found himself cornered at his office one afternoon by a longtime client who had read about the donation. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," the client said, his tone both admiring and slightly reproachful. "I hope you know what a gift she gave this city." Mark, who prided himself on controlling conversations, was uncharacteristically quiet. In that pause, the client's gaze lingered, as if searching for a sign that Mark understood the weight of what had been lost. Not just financially, but morally. Laura's encounters were more social, but equally cutting. At the country club, acquaintances congratulated her on her mother's visionary decision. Some meant it sincerely. Others let the compliment hang in the air with just enough inflection to make her uncomfortable. Over glasses of white wine, Laura would nod and say something polite, but inside she must have felt the sting of being an accessory to a legacy she had no part in building. There was no reclaiming that narrative. It belonged to me now, and to the city. The grandchildren's relationship with the house shifted in subtle ways. One afternoon, the eldest granddaughter came alone, slipping into a tour without announcing herself. She stayed at the back, lingering longer than the others in Arthur's study and in the kitchen where I'd baked pies every Thanksgiving. When she left, she paused on the porch, running her fingers along the railing as if it held some secret. I imagined her, tucking the memory away quietly, perhaps to revisit later when she was older and ready to face the truth about our family. The grandson, who had called me crazy, avoided the house entirely at first, but about a month after the opening, he appeared one rainy Tuesday when the tours were quiet. The docent recognized him instantly, but said nothing, simply handing him a pamphlet. He moved slowly through the rooms, and when he reached the library, he stopped in front of the display holding my favorite book, The Age of Reason. He didn't open it. He just stared at the inscription I had written for him, his lips tightening. Some lessons don't need to be spoken twice. As the months passed, the Historical Society began hosting community events in the house, poetry readings in the parlor, lectures on local history in the library, and small concerts in the garden brought new life to spaces that had once been private. People began to refer to it as Harriet's house, even in official announcements. My name had become woven into the city's rhythm, part of the fabric of daily life. For someone who had been laughed at and dismissed in her own dining room, this was the sweetest form of vindication. Mark and Laura, perhaps sensing that their absence was becoming more noticeable than their presence, attended one of the evening lectures together. It was about the women's suffrage movement in Rhode Island, a cause I had lived and breathed for years. The speaker mentioned my name more than once, crediting me for organizing marches and pushing for local reforms. Sitting there among neighbors and strangers, my children were forced to hear applause for a version of me they had ignored, one they had never bothered to understand. By the time the lecture ended, and the crowd filtered out onto the porch, I like to think Mark and Laura felt the quiet pressure of being on the outside looking in. The house no longer represented inheritance or leverage. It was now a place where my values lived on, without them. That was the truth I had wanted them to see. And now, whether they admitted it or not, it stood before them in brick, wood, and history. The first signs of tension between Mark and Laura surfaced not long after that lecture. At a family brunch, one of those half-hearted attempts to stay connected, Mark made a comment about how Laura should have handled me better in my final years. Laura, usually poised, shot back that he had been too busy chasing deals to notice what was happening. Their voices stayed low, but the bitterness underneath was sharp. For years, their greed had united them. Now, the loss of the house and the public narrative surrounding it seemed to be prying them apart. The grandchildren noticed it too. Family gatherings, already rare, became even more awkward. Conversations hovered around neutral topics, and any mention of me or the house caused a visible shift in the air. The eldest granddaughter began quietly excusing herself from these events, claiming work or school obligations. The grandson who had visited the library kept to himself, speaking less and observing more. It was as though each of them was processing the same unspoken truth. They had misjudged me, and perhaps, in doing so, they had misjudged themselves. Laura, desperate to regain some social footing, tried hosting a charity luncheon at her own home. She invited several members of the Historical Society, likely hoping to align herself with the goodwill generated by the donation, but it backfired. Guests made polite conversation, yes, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. They saw her as tangential to the story, a footnote at best. One attendee even remarked, "It's wonderful your mother had such foresight," a statement that left Laura smiling tightly while her fingers clenched her napkin. Mark, meanwhile, threw himself into work, taking on high-profile projects, as if professional success could overwrite personal failure. Yet even in his circles, the topic came up. At networking events, colleagues mentioned reading about the house, asking if he had been involved in the decision. Each time, Mark had to navigate between admitting the truth and trying to save face. The more he dodged the question, the more people seemed to know. The grandchildren began to form their own quiet connections to the house, independent of their parents. The eldest granddaughter volunteered for a few events, helping with guest check-ins and even assisting in the garden. She never made a show of it. No social media posts, no boasting, but the docents noticed. One day, while trimming the rose bushes, she told a volunteer that she remembered me pruning them in the same way, humming a tune under my breath. The volunteer smiled and said, "You must have inherited her patience." The girl didn't reply, but her eyes softened. The grandson who had once mocked me started reading more about local history. A librarian later mentioned seeing him borrow books on the suffrage movement and on Providence architecture. Whether it was guilt, curiosity, or something else entirely, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was beginning to see the world beyond his own assumptions, something I had always hoped for. By early spring, the house hosted a special exhibit about my life and work. Old photographs, protest banners, letters to politicians, all displayed alongside artifacts from the house. Visitors could listen to recordings of speeches I had given, my voice crackling, through old audio equipment. The exhibit drew large crowds, including journalists who had covered the donation months earlier. For the first time, the narrative wasn't just about the house. It was about the woman who had lived in it, fought for her beliefs, and chosen to protect its soul. Mark and Laura both attended the opening of that exhibit, though not together. They moved through the rooms separately, each avoiding the other's gaze, standing in front of a photograph of me at a rally in the 70s. Mark looked older, wearier. Laura lingered by a display of personal letters, her eyes scanning my handwriting. Neither of them said much to anyone, but their presence alone told its own story. No matter how far they tried to distance themselves, my choices had become inescapable. As the exhibit gained traction, local media began revisiting my life story in greater detail. Articles appeared not just in Providence papers, but in regional publications, highlighting my activism, my role in historic preservation, and my decision to place the city's heritage above family inheritance. These pieces were written with a tone of admiration, often accompanied by archival photographs of me, marching, speaking, or working in the garden. For the public, I had become a symbol of conviction and independence. For my family, every headline was another reminder of the narrative they couldn't control. The Historical Society capitalized on this momentum by launching an educational program in my name. The Harriet Thorne Fellowship offered grants to young historians and activists dedicated to preserving community history. Applications poured in from across the state, and each recipient's work would, in some way, connect back to the principles I had lived by. My name was being attached to new ideas, fresh energy, and the kind of forward movement I had always believed in. It was a living legacy, something no bank account could match. Mark heard about the fellowship during a business lunch, when a client mentioned their daughter had applied. The client spoke warmly about my contribution to the city, describing it as a gift that will ripple for generations. Mark smiled politely, but the conversation left him unsettled. He had built his career on creating tangible, profitable projects. Now he was confronted with the idea that value could exist in something intangible, something rooted in ideals rather than transactions. Laura encountered the fellowship in a more personal way. One of her friends, a gallery owner, asked if she would consider hosting a fundraising event for it. The request was well-meaning, but Laura declined, claiming she was too busy. In truth, she couldn't bear the thought of being a secondary figure at an event centered on me. The more the fellowship grew, the more it highlighted the absence of her own contributions to anything lasting. The grandchildren, however, reacted differently. The eldest granddaughter attended the fellowship's launch event, standing quietly at the back of the room as the first recipients spoke about their projects. One young woman was restoring oral histories from Providence's immigrant communities. Another was creating a digital archive of local protest movements. Listening to them, the granddaughter began to see how my decision had opened doors for people she'd never met. She told a friend later, I used to think it was about the house. It's not. It's about what the house can do. Even the grandson who had called me crazy showed signs of change. He volunteered for one of the fellowship's community projects, helping to digitize historical photographs. Among the images was one of the parlor in my house during a meeting in 1965. Women gathered with notepads and determined expressions. He recognized my face immediately, not from family albums, but from the way the docents described me, a woman who didn't wait for permission to act. For the first time, he began telling people he was related to me without following it with a joke. By summer, the house was no longer just a preserved space. It was a hub of activity. Tours ran daily, workshops filled the library, and the garden became a popular spot for small weddings and community gatherings. Every event carried a piece of my story, woven into the speeches and signage, ensuring that visitors left knowing exactly why the house had been saved. The name, Harriet Thorne, became synonymous with resilience in the face of condescension, with choosing principle over comfort. Mark and Laura couldn't avoid the house's presence in their lives, no matter how much they tried. It appeared in news feeds, in conversations, even in casual references at social events. They were living in a city where my decision had become part of the collective memory, and whether they admitted it or not, they were now defined in part by how they had reacted to it. That was the quiet truth I had left for them to wrestle with, an inheritance of reflection instead of riches. By early autumn, the tension within the family was no longer just an undercurrent. It had become visible in every interaction. At a rare dinner where Mark, Laura, and the grandchildren sat at the same table, conversations stumbled over half-finished sentences. When someone mentioned the house, the air tightened. Laura would take a sip of wine. Mark would glance down at his plate. The grandchildren, once quick to change the subject, now sometimes let the topic linger, almost testing the edges of what could be said without sparking an argument. It was clear that the silence surrounding my decision had begun to fray. The eldest granddaughter, perhaps emboldened by her volunteer work, finally broke that silence one night. She told the table about a recent event at the house, a reading of letters from Providence women during the suffrage movement, and how powerful it had been. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. It made me realize how much history we lose when we only think about ourselves, she said. Mark shifted in his chair. Laura set down her fork with a little more force than necessary. No one directly challenged her, but the discomfort was plain. Laura tried to regain control of the conversation by changing the subject to a charity gala she was planning, yet even that came back to the house. One of her guests, she admitted reluctantly, had asked if she could host it there. The idea seemed to sting. After all, it was no longer hers to offer. Mark muttered, something about milking a story, but his tone lacked conviction. Both of them seemed to understand that the house's reputation now carried more social weight than anything they could personally orchestrate. The grandson, who had been helping with the digitization project, remained quiet during these family gatherings, but he listened closely. His posture had changed, less defensive, more thoughtful. He noticed things differently now, like how his mother and uncle spoke about the house in terms of loss, while his sister and cousins spoke of it in terms of preservation. It was a subtle but profound shift, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Outside of family dynamics, the city continued to embrace the house as a cultural anchor. Local schools began integrating visits into their history curriculum, ensuring that each new generation learned about the movements I had fought for and the value of keeping heritage intact. Teachers spoke of the experience as more than a field trip. It was a lesson in ownership, of history, of identity, of values. These children would grow up seeing the house as theirs in a communal sense, a stark contrast to how my own children had viewed it. Mark and Laura's absence from public events at the house became a talking point in social circles. Some speculated they stayed away out of resentment. Others believed it was shame. Either way, it deepened the divide between them and the rest of the community. Even casual acquaintances began, framing conversations about them through the lens of my decision, as though the legacy of the house was now inseparable from their names. In quieter moments, away from the scrutiny of the public, Laura began visiting the house alone. She never told anyone, not even Mark. She'd slip in during less busy hours, walking through the rooms slowly, sometimes pausing in Arthur's study or in the garden. She didn't speak to the docents, and they didn't approach her. Perhaps she came looking for answers, or perhaps for something she couldn't name, but each visit seemed to leave her quieter than before. Mark's private reckoning came differently. Late one evening, he found himself going through old photo albums, many of which he had ignored for years. He stopped at one picture, me, standing on the porch with him as a boy, my arm around his shoulders, both of us smiling at something out of frame. For a long moment, he just stared, realizing that the photograph I had left him wasn't chosen at random. It had been the bridge I offered, and the reminder of when our bond was still unbroken. Laura's visits to the house became almost a ritual. She would arrive mid-morning, always alone, dressed in muted colors instead of her usual polished ensembles. She walked with a kind of hesitance, as though stepping into a place where she was both welcome and unwelcome at the same time. In the parlor, she often sat in the same armchair I had favored, her hands folded in her lap, eyes scanning the room. She didn't touch anything, but she stayed long enough for the docents to notice that she seemed less restless with each visit. They never asked why she came. They simply let her exist in the space. Mark's confrontation with the photograph I had left him stayed with him in unexpected ways. At first, he kept it tucked in the back of a drawer, but over time he moved it to his desk. He began catching himself looking at it during quiet moments at work, his eyes lingering on the details, the frayed edge of my sweater, the curve of my smile, the way his younger self leaned into me without hesitation. The memory it stirred wasn't about the house or the will. It was about belonging. It was about a time before money and property had become the currency of connection. The grandchildren's involvement with the Historical Society deepened. The eldest granddaughter began taking on more responsibility at events, coordinating volunteers, and helping with new exhibits. She seemed to carry herself differently. Now, as though she understood she was protecting something worth far more than a deed. The grandson who had once mocked me continued his work on the digital archive, but he also started speaking to visitors about the photographs. Sometimes he would share a small personal story, careful to keep the focus on history rather than himself, but the docents could see the pride in his voice. One autumn afternoon, the Historical Society organized a special gathering for families who had contributed significantly to the preservation of Providence's heritage. My name was on the list, of course, but it was my granddaughter who attended in my place. She gave a short speech, her voice steady as she spoke about my grandmother's belief that history belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford to own it. The audience applauded warmly, and in that moment, she carried forward not just my words, but my conviction. Mark heard about that speech secondhand from a colleague who had been in the audience. "She's a lot like her grandmother," the man said with an approving smile. Mark only nodded, but later that night, he admitted to himself that the comparison had stung, not because it was untrue, but because it was. He recognized that the qualities being admired in his daughter were ones he had dismissed or undervalued in me. It was a quiet reckoning, the kind that doesn't lead to immediate change but leaves a mark all the same. Laura, too, found herself confronted by the way others spoke about me. At a luncheon, an acquaintance mentioned visiting the house for the first time and described feeling as though Harriet were still in the room. The comment caught Laura off guard. She had spent so long trying to control the narrative of my absence that she hadn't considered how present I still was in the minds of others. It wasn't a haunting. It was an enduring influence, and one she couldn't erase. The city's connection to the house only grew. New programs brought in speakers from across the state, and the fellowship bearing my name expanded with additional funding from donors inspired by the story. Every mention of it in the news included a recap of my decision to donate the property, reinforcing the values I had wanted to leave behind. Even those who had never met me began to talk about Harriet's house, as if it had always been there, a fixture of the community's conscience. By the first anniversary of the donation, the house was no longer just a point of pride. For the Historical Society, it had become a touchstone for conversations about legacy, stewardship, and the choices we make when faced with the pull of personal gain. My family remained fractured in some ways, but the sharp edges of resentment had dulled into something more reflective. They had begun, each in their own way, to sit with the truth of who I was and why I had chosen the path I did. The first anniversary of the donation was marked with an event the Historical Society called A day for Harriet. Flyers went up around town weeks in advance, featuring a photograph of the house in its autumn colors, the white columns framed by red and gold leaves. The program included guided tours, a panel discussion about women in local history, and a small evening reception in the garden. It was meant to be a celebration of legacy, but for my family, it was also an unspoken summons, an invitation they could neither fully accept nor entirely ignore. Laura arrived first, wearing a simple navy dress instead of her usual statement pieces. She kept her sunglasses on for longer than necessary, scanning the crowd as though measuring how many people might know her by name. Mark came later, his suit slightly rumpled, his expression unreadable. They didn't arrive together, but their presence was noted immediately. Whispers passed through the guests, curiosity tinged with the same restrained judgment that had followed them since the will was read. The grandchildren were already there. The eldest granddaughter was helping to coordinate the tours, moving with purpose between the entrance and the library. She greeted her mother and uncle politely, but without lingering, as though she had too many responsibilities to indulge in small talk. The grandson stood near the refreshment table, talking quietly with one of the docents. He gave a small nod to Mark but didn't approach. The physical space between them seemed to mirror the emotional one. Inside the house, the tours were in full swing. Visitors admired the newly restored dining room, complete with the table where the infamous intervention had taken place. A docent, unaware that my children were within earshot, told the story of how I had stood up from that table and walked away, choosing my dignity over argument. The guests listened with a mix of admiration and surprise, their eyes lingering on the empty chair at the head of the table. Mark, standing in the doorway, shifted his weight, but didn't interrupt. The panel discussion took place in the parlor, the chairs arranged in a semicircle. Speakers included historians, community leaders, and one of the fellowship's first recipients. Laura sat in the back row, her posture rigid, while Mark hovered near the side wall. When my name was mentioned, the audience applauded warmly. The fellowship recipient spoke about how my decision had inspired her to pursue a project documenting the lives of women factory workers in the early 20th century. Her words were passionate, and for a moment, even Mark seemed to listen without defensiveness. As the afternoon turned to evening, guests gathered in the garden for the reception. Strings of warm lights hung from the trees, casting a golden glow over the crowd. The eldest granddaughter took the small stage to thank everyone for coming. She spoke about the importance of preserving not just buildings, but the values tied to them. This house is more than wood and stone. It's a reminder that what we choose to protect says everything about who we are, she said, her voice steady. There was a pause before the applause, as if the weight of her words needed a moment to settle. Mark and Laura stood apart from the crowd, each holding a glass of wine they barely sipped. Neither spoke much, but both watched as the grandchildren mingled easily with the guests. It was clear that the younger generation had found a place in this story that their parents had never claimed. The realization seemed to hang between Mark and Laura like an unspoken truth neither wanted to confront in public. By the end of the night, as guests began to leave and the lights in the garden dimmed, the family found themselves briefly alone on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. They didn't argue, didn't rehash the past. They just stood there in silence, looking out over the lawn, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was the closest they had come in a long time to standing on common ground. In the weeks after A Day for Harriet, something subtle began to shift. Laura, who had once avoided public association with the house, started attending select events, not as a central figure, but as a quiet observer. She came to a lecture on urban preservation, sitting in the back and taking notes. A volunteer noticed her once lingering by the portrait of me in the library, her fingers brushing lightly against the frame before she moved on. She never spoke about these visits to anyone, but the fact that she kept returning hinted at a change she wasn't ready to name. Mark's transformation took a different shape. One morning, he called the Historical Society and offered to donate a small collection of documents he had found in his office, letters I had written to city officials during the preservation campaign for another historic building decades earlier. They were neatly stored in envelopes, some with my handwriting still sharp, others smudged from years of handling. When asked if he wanted public acknowledgement for the donation, he declined. "It's not about me," he said simply. For a man who had once measured worth in recognition, It was a quiet but meaningful step. The eldest granddaughter became almost inseparable from the life of the house. She took on the role of liaison between the fellowship recipients and the society, helping organize their presentations and ensuring their work reached the community. Her leadership didn't go unnoticed. The board began discussing the possibility of inviting her to join as a junior member. Though she never sought the spotlight, her dedication carried the same kind of steady conviction I had lived by, a trait that seemed to skip a generation before finding her. The grandson, still involved with the digital archive, began sharing stories about the project with friends at college. He spoke not just about the technical aspects, but about the personal history tied to the images, how each photograph told a story of resilience, struggle, or triumph. More than once, he mentioned my name without hesitation, framing me not as a distant relative, but as someone whose principles had started to shape his own worldview. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a marked departure from the boy who had once laughed at me at the dinner table. Outside the family, the city's relationship with the house deepened further. The fellowship expanded to include community service initiatives, pairing historical preservation with volunteer projects that directly benefited residents. The house became a meeting place for these efforts, a place where ideas were shared, plans were made, and friendships were forged. The walls that had once held private disputes now echoed with collaboration and purpose. Laura eventually agreed to participate in one of these community events, albeit reluctantly at first. She helped coordinate a charity auction, her organizational skills proving invaluable. Working alongside volunteers, she began to see faces she recognized from her mother's old social circles, people who spoke warmly of me, not in abstract terms, but with personal anecdotes. By the end of the evening, she admitted to one of them, "I didn't realize how much this place meant to people." It was the closest she had come to acknowledging the depth of my decision. Mark's involvement grew in quieter ways. He began stopping by the house during off hours, sometimes bringing coffee for the staff or asking about upcoming projects. Once, he even offered to help with minor repairs in the garden shed, surprising everyone. It wasn't grand, and it wasn't public, but it was a consistent presence, an unspoken acknowledgement that he was, at last, willing to contribute without expecting anything in return. By the second autumn after my passing, the changes were visible. The family was still far from reconciled, but the sharpness of their resentment had dulled into something more contemplative. They no longer spoke about what could have been in terms of inheritance. Instead, conversations, when they happened, were more likely to revolve around the work being done at the house. It was as if they had finally begun to understand that my last act had been less about taking something from them and more about giving something lasting to everyone else. Winter that year brought an unusual quiet to Providence. Snow blanketed the streets, and the house took on a postcard-like stillness, its white columns blending with the frost. Inside, the Historical Society prepared for the annual holiday gathering, a smaller, warmer event compared to the public celebrations. Invitations went out to volunteers, fellowship recipients, and a handful of community members who had played a key role in the year's projects. For the first time, both Mark and Laura accepted their invitations without hesitation. The grandchildren, by now deeply connected to the house, were already on the volunteer list. On the evening of the gathering, the house glowed with candlelight. Evergreen garlands lined the banisters, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. Guests mingled in the parlor, their voices low and warm, the kind of conversation that feels like it could last all night. Laura arrived with a tray of pastries she had baked herself, something she hadn't done in years. Mark came carrying a bottle of wine, chosen carefully to pair with the desserts. Their gestures weren't grand, but they were genuine, and they were noticed. The eldest granddaughter stood near the fireplace, introducing guests to one another and making sure everyone felt welcome. The grandson was stationed by the library, offering tours to those who hadn't yet seen the latest additions to the archive. It was a scene that, a year earlier, would have been unthinkable. Members of my family not just tolerating the house's role in the community, but actively contributing to it. The tension hadn't disappeared entirely, but the sharp edges had worn down to something more like shared purpose. At one point during the evening, a small group gathered in the dining room. Someone mentioned the table, how it had witnessed both difficult moments and joyful ones. Laura, standing nearby, surprised herself by speaking up. "That table was my mother's command center," she said with a faint smile. "If you were sitting there, you were either about to be fed or about to be told what needed to be done." The group laughed, and for a brief moment, the memory didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. Mark found himself in Arthur's old study, showing a guest the worn leather chair behind the desk. "She wouldn't let anyone replace it," he explained. "Said it had the right shape for thinking." The guest nodded appreciatively, and Mark realized he was telling the story without bitterness, maybe even with a touch of pride. It struck him then that the chair, like the house, had survived not because it was perfect, but because it had been cared for. As the evening wound down, the guests gathered in the library for a toast. The director of the Historical Society thanked everyone for their contributions over the past year, then turned to acknowledge the presence of my family. "It's not easy to navigate change, especially when it comes with loss," she said. "But tonight, we are all part of the same story." Glasses clinked, and for once, Mark and Laura didn't shy away from being part of the moment. After the toast, the eldest, granddaughter slipped into the garden for some air. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the glow of the string lights. Laura followed a few minutes later, wrapping her coat tighter around her. They stood together in comfortable silence until Laura finally said, "She would have liked this." The granddaughter nodded. "She would have loved it," she replied. And for the first time, the words felt like a bridge rather than a wall. When the night ended and the family stepped out into the cold, they didn't leave separately. They walked together down the snowy path to their cars, their footsteps falling into the same rhythm. It wasn't reconciliation in the cinematic sense, but it was something real, a quiet acknowledgement that the house had given them back piece by piece, a sense of belonging they didn't know they'd been missing. Spring arrived earlier than usual the following year, and with it came an idea from the Historical Society to host a memorial garden day in my honor. The plan was to invite volunteers and community members to help tend the grounds, plant new flowers, and share stories about their connection to the house. The board extended a personal invitation to my family, and this time, there was no hesitation. Even Mark, who once avoided the property unless necessary, agreed to spend the day working alongside the rest. On the morning of the event, the garden buzzed with activity. Tables held trays of seedlings, lilies, hydrangeas, and the same deep red roses I had loved. Children ran across the lawn with watering cans, while older volunteers knelt in the soil, their hands steady and practiced. The grandchildren arrived early, already wearing gloves and ready to work. Laura came carrying a flat of lavender plants, explaining softly that they had been my favorite scent. Mark brought a small tool set and went straight to repairing one of the benches under the elm tree. As the hours passed, the family naturally fell into the rhythm of the day. Laura worked alongside, the eldest granddaughter in the rose beds, the two of them sharing quiet conversation between tasks. Mark joined the grandson in the vegetable patch, laughing at how crooked their rows were turning out. There was no forced sentimentality, no awkwardness, just the simple act of doing something together for a purpose that belonged to all of them. Midway through the afternoon, one of the docents approached with a box of small wooden markers. Each volunteer was invited to write a short message or memory and place it somewhere in the garden. The markers would remain until weather wore them away, a reminder that stories, like flowers, needed tending. The eldest granddaughter wrote, "For the woman who taught me to see the bigger picture." The grandson paused for a long time before writing simply, "I hope you knew I listened." Eventually, Laura's marker read, "Thank you for holding the line when I couldn't see where it led." Mark's was the last to go into the box. He wrote nothing at first, then quietly printed, "You were right to protect it." No one commented on what the others had written, but each of them found a place in the garden to set their marker, pressing it into the earth like planting a seed. By the end of the day, the garden looked transformed. New blooms softened the edges of the paths, and the scent of freshly turned soil hung in the air. Volunteers lingered to chat, sipping lemonade on the porch, while the family stood together at the edge of the lawn. They watched as children darted between flower beds and older couples strolled hand in hand, pointing out details of the house. It was the kind of scene I would have loved, alive, grounded, and full of quiet purpose. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the garden, The director of the Historical Society gathered everyone for a brief closing. She spoke about how a garden was never truly finished, just as a legacy was never truly complete. "It's something we keep working on together," she said, and Harriet understood that better than anyone. The crowd nodded, and for a moment, even the breeze seemed to still. When the event ended, the family didn't rush to leave. They wandered the garden slowly, stopping at each of their markers. There was no formal goodbye, no dramatic moment of closure, but in the way they walked side by side toward the gate, sharing the same pace, there was an unspoken agreement. The house was no longer a point of division. It was a shared inheritance of responsibility, memory, and meaning, exactly as I had hoped it would be. A few months later, the Historical Society announced a special evening to mark the 2nd anniversary of the house's public opening. It would be a night of reflection and gratitude, with speeches from fellowship recipients, music in the garden, and a final unveiling. A bronze plaque at the front gate bearing my name and a short inscription. The wording had been kept secret from my family, though they were all invited. This time, there was no hesitation, no visible reluctance. They came as a group, arriving together just before dusk. The house looked luminous under the soft glow of lanterns, the white columns catching the fading light. Guests gathered in the garden, where chairs had been set in a semicircle facing the gate. The air carried the scent of roses and lavender, mingling with the distant hum of the city. My eldest granddaughter sat with Laura in the front row, while the grandson took a seat beside Mark. Their posture was relaxed, their expressions open. It was a small but telling sign of how far they had come from that dinner table years earlier. The director began the evening by speaking about the transformation of the house into a space for learning, connection, and community. She spoke not just of my donation, but of the way it had inspired others to consider what they might leave behind. Fellowship recipients shared updates on their projects, each weaving in a thread of how the house had influenced their work. As they spoke, I imagined my family listening in a way they hadn't before, without defensiveness, without comparison, simply taking in the impact. When it came time to unveil the plaque, the director asked the family to join her at the gate. Laura's hand tightened briefly around her daughter's arm, and Mark gave a small nod to the grandson. Together, they pulled back the cloth, revealing the bronze surface. The inscription read, "Harriet Thorne, 1933-2021, Advocate, Preserver, Believer in the Power of a Well-Chosen Legacy." Beneath it, in smaller letters, she chose to give this house to the city she loved, so that its stories, and hers, would never be forgotten. The crowd applauded, but it wasn't the kind of applause that fades quickly. It was warm, sustained, and personal, the kind that makes people glance at one another and smile. The family stood there for a long moment, reading the words again. The eldest granddaughter reached out and traced the edge of the plaque with her fingertips. The grandson glanced at Mark, who gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, one of acknowledgement, maybe even acceptance. After the ceremony, guests lingered in the garden, sipping wine and talking quietly. The family stayed too, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. They spoke with fellowship recipients, thanked volunteers, and even laughed together at one point. It wasn't about rewriting the past, it never could be, but about finding a place in the present where they could stand together without the weight of old arguments pressing in. As the evening drew to a close, the four of them walked toward the gate again. The street was quiet now, the lanterns casting long shadows across the path. They paused in front of the plaque, not speaking, just looking. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they stepped through the gate together and into the night. It wasn't a reconciliation sealed with words. It was one marked by movement, by the simple act of leaving side by side. And so, the house remained, solid, graceful, alive with voices and footsteps, its walls holding not just the story of my life, but the story of what came after. The laughter that once stung had been replaced by something softer, the sound of people carrying forward what they'd learned, even if it took them years to understand. In the end, that was the last laugh I'd wanted. Not one of mockery, but of quiet satisfaction that the legacy had found its place. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Sometimes, the hardest battles are fought quietly, in the spaces between words and within the walls we call home. Have you ever felt overlooked or misunderstood by those closest to you? Or maybe you've had to make a choice that changed everything, even if it meant standing alone. Tell me what you felt or experienced that was similar. Your story matters here. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might relate. Sometimes a story is exactly what someone needs to find strength. And if you want to hear more stories like this, made for those seeking truth and emotion in what they listen to, stay here with me. Let's learn together, gently and with respect, from what life has to teach us. Every life carries its scars and moments of redemption, and in those, we find our humanity. Thank you for listening to mine, for letting it enter your world. Until the next story, with all its truth and sincerity.